Some single-player games are fun for a weekend, but these 20 can completely take over your free time. I've picked games with unforgettable worlds, great stories, satisfying gameplay, and enough personality to make you want to keep playing. I still remember how easy it was to lose an entire evening in The Elder Scrolls IV, Oblivion Remastered, without even touching the main quest. You might start by chasing a simple objective, then notice a strange ruin in the distance and decide to investigate. A few minutes later, you're fighting through ancient halls, finding weird loot, and wondering where the last 2 hours went. That's the magic of Oblivion. The remaster makes that freedom look much better, but it doesn't lose the unpredictable personality that made the original so memorable. The world feels packed with places worth wandering into, and some of the best moments happen when you're not following a plan at all. I also love how quests can turn into stories you actually remember, especially when a harmless decision suddenly creates complete chaos. It's not perfect, and some older design choices still show through. But if you want an RPG where curiosity constantly pulls you off course, Oblivion Remastered is incredibly easy to get lost in.
Burn the dragon fires!
I didn't expect Assassin's Creed Shadows to make me slow down and actually enjoy moving through its world. Playing as Nioh feels completely different from Yasuke, and switching between them gives the game a nice rhythm. Nioh is at her best when you're sneaking across rooftops, hiding in the grass, and quietly picking apart an enemy camp. Then Yasuke comes in and completely changes the mood. His fights feel heavier, louder, and much more direct. What surprised me most is how often the changing seasons affect the way you approach an area. Snow, rain, and thick vegetation can make familiar locations feel completely different. The story won't hit everyone equally, and the open world can still feel familiar if you've played several Assassin's Creed games. But when everything clicks, Shadows captures that feeling of being a lone warrior moving through feudal Japan, choosing whether to disappear into the night or fight your way through the front gate. The first time, Doom. The Dark Ages really clicked for me. I stopped thinking about surviving and started thinking about how much damage I could cause. The game takes Doom's usual speed and aggression into a brutal medieval setting, and somehow that combination works incredibly well. You're smashing through demons with heavy weapons, blocking attacks with the shield saw, and turning enemy attacks against them. The combat feels more deliberate than some of the faster Doom games, but it never becomes slow. Every fight pushes you to keep moving and make quick decisions. I also like how the world gives you bigger spaces to explore between the chaos, with hidden areas and upgrades rewarding players who look beyond the obvious path. The story isn't really the reason I'd recommend it, but the atmosphere absolutely helps sell the experience. After a while, you stop wondering how you're going to survive the next fight. You're already looking forward to it, and that says a lot about how satisfying the combat feels. I didn't expect Clair Obscur, Expedition 33 to stick in my head the way it did, especially after some of its quieter moments. The game starts with a strange mystery, then slowly pulls you deeper into a world that feels beautiful and unsettling at the same time. Its turn-based combat is where things get really interesting. You can't just sit back and choose attacks on autopilot. Dodging, parrying, and timing your abilities can completely change how a fight plays out. When you finally land a perfect counter against a powerful enemy, it feels incredibly satisfying. But the combat isn't the only reason this game stands out. The characters give the journey real weight, and their relationships make the bigger moments hit harder. I also love how much personality the world has. Every area feels carefully designed instead of being another generic fantasy backdrop. It does take some patience to understand its systems, but once everything clicks, Expedition 33 becomes surprisingly hard to put down. I thought Kingdom Come, Deliverance 2 would just give me a bigger version of the first game, but it surprised me with how alive everything feels. You play as Henry, and this isn't the kind of RPG where everyone waits around for you to arrive. People have jobs, routines, problems, and their own reactions to what you do. Even something as simple as walking into town can turn into an unexpected situation. The combat takes practice too, especially when you're surrounded and trying not to panic. Winning a tough fight feels satisfying because you actually had to learn how the system works. What really kept me playing, though, was the freedom to solve quests in completely different ways. You can talk your way through a problem, sneak around, investigate clues, or sometimes just make things worse. It can be slow at times, and that won't work for everyone. But if you want an RPG that makes you feel like you're actually living in its world, Kingdom Come, Deliverance 2 is hard to ignore.
Oh, for fuck's sake! Yeah, I only just avoided being...
I knew Black Myth. Wukong looked impressive, but I wasn't prepared for how much fun it would be to simply explore and fight through its world. The combat feels fast and focused, with every staff swing having real weight behind it. Boss fights are where the game really shows what it can do. Some enemies can destroy you in seconds, but learning their patterns makes the eventual victory feel earned. I also enjoyed how often the game hides something just beyond the obvious path. You might be heading toward the next objective, notice a strange trail, and suddenly find yourself facing a completely different challenge. The world draws heavily from Chinese mythology, and that gives many locations and enemies a distinct identity. It's not a perfect action RPG, and some exploration systems can feel confusing without much explanation. But once you're locked into a difficult fight and finally figure out the timing, Wukong becomes incredibly satisfying. It's the kind of game where one more boss attempt can easily turn into another hour. I didn't expect Stellar Blade to keep surprising me after the first few hours, but its combat ended up being the biggest reason I wanted to keep going. Playing as Eve, every fight feels built around timing rather than simply mashing attacks. Perfect parries and well-timed dodges can completely change the momentum of a battle, especially when you're facing an enemy you've already struggled against. Then there are the bosses, which often turn into these dramatic battles where learning their patterns matters more than having the strongest gear. What caught me off guard was the world itself. Behind the flashy presentation, there are quieter areas, strange characters, and small discoveries that give the journey more personality than I expected. The story can be uneven, and some dialogue won't work for everyone. Still, when the combat, music, visuals, and atmosphere come together, Stellar Blade has a style that's hard to confuse with anything else. And once the combat finally clicks, even basic encounters start feeling like something you want to master. Ghost of Tsushima is one of those games where I could forget the main objective just by following something moving across the landscape. One moment, you're riding through the countryside, and the next, a fox leads you toward a hidden shrine you never knew existed. That sense of discovery makes the island feel like more than a giant map filled with icons. Then the sword combat gives the whole experience a completely different rhythm. Fights can be quick and brutal, especially when you stop relying on constant attacks and start reading your opponent. I also love how the game slowly changes Jin's journey from a traditional samurai story into something much more personal. His choices create tension between honor and survival, and that conflict gives the story real weight. Some side activities can become repetitive, especially if you're trying to clear everything. But you don't need to do that. Sometimes the best way to play Ghost of Tsushima is simply to put the objective aside and see where the wind takes you. The first time I swung across New York in Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, I understood why movement alone could carry an entire game. Spider-Man feels incredibly natural to control, and once you learn how to chain swings together, traveling across the city becomes something you actually want to do. You can launch off buildings, dive toward the streets, and pull yourself back up without breaking the flow. Then a random crime appears, and suddenly you're dropping into a fight just because you can. The combat has that same sense of freedom. You're bouncing between enemies, using the environment, dodging attacks, and trying to keep your combo alive. But what surprised me most was the story. Peter isn't just dealing with supervillains. He's trying to balance being Spider-Man with everything happening in his personal life. Some side missions aren't quite as memorable, but the main journey carries enough emotional weight to keep you invested. And when the soundtrack kicks in during a big swing across Manhattan, it still feels ridiculously good. I didn't fully understand what made Control special until I stopped treating it like a normal third-person shooter. The moment Jessie starts throwing objects across a room with her mind, the whole game changes. Fights become chaotic in the best possible way. You're dodging bullets, launching furniture at enemies, and using your powers to control the space around you. But the combat is only half the experience. The Federal Bureau of Control is one of the strangest places I've explored in a game, with shifting rooms, unsettling experiments, and mysteries that rarely give you a simple explanation. You constantly get the feeling that something is happening just outside your understanding. That can also be the game's biggest weakness. The story gets confusing, and some areas can feel frustrating when you're not sure where you're supposed to go. Still, that uncertainty fits the atmosphere perfectly. Control rewards curiosity, and the deeper you explore, the more bizarre the whole place becomes. Sometimes being confused is exactly what makes it so memorable. Nioh 2 taught me pretty quickly that button mashing was going to get me absolutely nowhere. Every fight feels like a small test of patience, timing, and knowing when to attack. The combat has incredible depth, but what makes it special is how many different ways you can build your character. You can experiment with weapons, skills, armor, and abilities until you find a setup that completely changes how you approach enemies. The yokai abilities add another layer, especially when you're fighting something that seemed impossible a few attempts earlier. I also love the feeling of finally understanding a boss. At first, their attacks look overwhelming. Then you start recognizing the patterns, find your openings, and suddenly the same fight feels manageable. Nioh 2 can be brutally difficult though, and its huge number of systems might feel overwhelming at first. But if you're willing to learn instead of rushing through it, the combat becomes incredibly rewarding. Few action RPGs make improvement itself feel this satisfying. Metro Exodus Complete Edition made me appreciate slower games again. Instead of constantly throwing enemies at you, it gives you room to breathe, explore, and wonder what might be waiting around the next corner. Artyom's journey across post-apocalyptic Russia feels surprisingly personal because the environments keep changing. One moment you're moving through an abandoned settlement, and later you're crossing a huge open area where danger can come from almost anywhere. The weapon system also makes every encounter feel more deliberate. Ammunition can be limited, weapons get dirty, and wasting resources can come back to hurt you later. What really stayed with me, though, was how the game lets quiet moments sit between the violence. Talking with your crew on the train can feel just as important as surviving a dangerous mission. The Complete Edition also includes the 2 major story expansions, giving you even more reason to return. It's not the fastest shooter on this list, but if you want atmosphere and immersion, Metro Exodus is something special.
Where are you going, you windbag?
A Plague Tale. Requiem has this strange ability to make you feel powerful for one moment and completely helpless the next. Playing as Amisha, you're constantly trying to protect Hugo while surviving a world that seems determined to break them apart. The rat swarms are easily the most memorable part. Seeing thousands of them move through an area is disturbing, but figuring out how to manipulate light and darkness around them can be surprisingly clever. Stealth also plays a bigger role than you'd expect, especially when facing enemies you can't simply overpower. What really kept me invested, though, was the relationship between Amisha and Hugo. Their journey gets darker as the story moves forward, and some of the choices they make are genuinely uncomfortable to watch. The game can sometimes push its drama a little too hard, and the stealth sections aren't always perfect. Still, when the atmosphere, story, and sound design come together, Requiem creates a kind of tension that's difficult to shake off. It's beautiful, disturbing, and definitely not an easy journey. Death Stranding is probably the strangest game on this list, and that's exactly why I think everyone should experience it at least once. At first, delivering packages across a ruined America sounds incredibly simple. Then you actually start walking, and suddenly the terrain becomes part of the challenge. Rivers, mountains, steep slopes, and storms can turn one delivery into a serious expedition. What makes it work is the feeling of gradually becoming better at crossing that world. You start planning routes, carrying the right equipment, and eventually using roads, bridges, and other structures created by players. That shared world can create some surprisingly wholesome moments in a game that's otherwise so lonely. The story is much harder to explain without ruining the experience, but it becomes increasingly strange and ambitious as you uncover what's really happening. I'll admit the opening hours can feel painfully slow, and the story throws a lot at you. But once Death Stranding clicks, walking from one place to another can feel more meaningful than most action games make combat feel. I didn't expect Days Gone Remastered to make me genuinely nervous about running out of fuel. Early on, even getting across the map can feel like a problem because your bike isn't just transportation, it's basically your lifeline. Then you hear a freaker swarm nearby, and suddenly, that simple trip becomes a completely different situation. The best moments come when you accidentally attract too many enemies and have to improvise your escape. Deacon isn't the most cheerful protagonist, and the story takes a while to find its rhythm, but the world becomes more interesting as you spend time in it. Riding through forests, abandoned towns, and dangerous roads gives the game a strong sense of isolation. The remastered version also improves the presentation and adds newer features that make the experience feel smoother on modern hardware. Some missions can feel repetitive, and the pacing isn't always perfect. But once you have a bike you trust and a swarm starts chasing you, Days Gone becomes surprisingly tense. Those moments are hard to forget. Resident Evil Village wastes very little time reminding you that nowhere is safe. The moment Ethan Winters enters that snowy village, the atmosphere starts doing most of the work. You can hear something moving nearby, but you don't always know where it is. Then the game suddenly throws you into a completely different nightmare, and the tone shifts again. That's one of my favorite things about Village. It keeps changing the kind of horror you're dealing with, so you never get too comfortable. The combat is also satisfying without turning the game into a pure action shooter. You're constantly deciding whether to spend ammunition or save it for something worse. And then there are the major encounters, which each have their own personality and style. The story can get pretty ridiculous, especially toward the later sections, but I think that's part of its charm. Village knows when to scare you and when to let you have fun. If you want survival horror with strong action and memorable locations, this one delivers. Hades 2 surprised me because losing a run never felt like wasted time. You play as Melinoa, and every attempt gives you another chance to experiment with different abilities, weapons, and upgrades. The combat feels incredibly quick, but there's always enough room to make smart decisions instead of simply attacking everything in sight. One run might give you a build that turns your attacks into a complete nightmare for enemies, while the next forces you to play much more carefully. I also love how the characters make the world feel alive between runs. You're not just restarting because you died, you're returning to a place where conversations, relationships, and new discoveries keep moving forward. Since Hades' Descent has been developed through early access, some parts have naturally changed and expanded over time, so the experience can evolve with updates. That makes it a little different from a finished traditional RPG, But even with that caveat, the core loop is incredibly addictive. One more run can turn into 5 before you even realize how late it is.
Adequate.
Ori and the Will of the Wisps is one of those games that can make a simple jump feel surprisingly emotional. The world looks beautiful from the moment you start exploring, but there's much more going on beneath that gorgeous art style. Movement is the real star here. As Ori gains new abilities, areas that once looked impossible suddenly become reachable, and getting back to an old location can reveal an entirely different route. The platforming also gets increasingly creative, especially when you're flying, bouncing, dashing, and chaining abilities together without stopping. Then the music kicks in during a major escape sequence, and the whole game suddenly feels bigger than it has any right to be. The story can get quite emotional, sometimes without saying much at all. A few platforming sections can be demanding, but the game usually makes failure feel like part of the learning process. What I love most is how naturally exploration and movement fit together. You're not just moving through the world, you're learning how to move through it better. Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition is the kind of game that makes you feel ridiculously cool once you finally understand what you're doing. At first, the combat can look completely overwhelming, especially when you see someone chaining attacks without touching the ground. Then you start learning the moves yourself, and suddenly every enemy becomes an opportunity to experiment. Playing as Dante is especially wild because his different styles and weapons let you completely change your approach during a fight. Nioh feels more direct, while V brings something totally different to the table. The bosses are another highlight, with fights that reward aggression but still punish careless mistakes. What keeps me coming back is the freedom to improve. You can finish a mission and immediately think about how much cleaner you could have played it. The story isn't going to redefine action games, and some missions feel a little uneven. But that's not really why you play Devil May Cry 5. You play it because making a ridiculous combo finally work feels unbelievably satisfying.
Settle back. Reap what you sow.
Mass Effect Legendary Edition is the kind of trilogy that makes you wish you could experience it again without knowing what happens next. You play as Commander Shepard, but what makes the journey special is how much your decisions actually shape your experience across all 3 games. Characters you meet early can become some of the people you care about most, and even small conversations can feel important later. The Normandy crew is a huge part of that. Spending time with them, learning their stories, and watching those relationships develop makes the galaxy feel surprisingly personal. The combat also improves as the trilogy moves forward, but for me, the real reason to play is the sense of adventure. You're jumping between planets, uncovering strange civilizations, making difficult choices, and slowly realizing how massive the conflict really is. Some parts of the trilogy have aged better than others, but the Legendary Edition brings the entire journey together beautifully. And when you finally reach the end, it feels less like finishing a game and more like saying goodbye to a crew you've traveled with for years. That's the list. 20 single-player games, and honestly, choosing just one is the hardest part. Now I want to know which game you're most excited to play. Drop your pick in the comments and tell me which game you think should have made this list. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe for more gaming recommendations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.